My daughter-in-law told me I had to start paying rent in my own home. I froze as the words hung in the air, sharper than a knife. My son stood beside her, eyes downcast, nodding quietly as if he had forgotten who had raised him. I felt my chest tighten and my stomach churn as I looked around the living room, every corner holding memories of my life, my son's childhood, the laughter of holidays and birthday candles, now threatened by a woman who claimed authority over me. She leaned against the couch armrest, sipping her coffee with a smug smile, the kind of smile that seemed to say victory was hers and I was nothing. I swallowed hard, but no words came out. "Rent," I whispered, as if testing the syllables. She tilted her head and laughed softly, a sound cruel and calculated. "It's simple. You pay or you leave." My son hesitated, then said softly, "We should do as she says." The betrayal felt like a punch to the gut. All those years of cooking for him, cleaning for him, guiding him, teaching him love and patience now seemed erased by a polished grin and a voice that had convinced my son to forget his own mother. I turned away and walked to the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, my hands shaking, but my face calm. I poured tea into my favorite cup and let the warmth seep into my fingers, but it did nothing to soothe the ache in my chest. I kept thinking, was I truly that disposable? Was my love so easily forgotten? That night I lay awake listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of my house, the house that had always comforted me, as if whispering its solidarity. I thought of every birthday party, every scraped knee, every school project proudly displayed on the fridge, and felt a small ember of defiance stir inside me. I realized then that I would not be humiliated in my own home. I would not allow anyone to dictate terms in the place I had built with my own hands. I did not yet know how, but I knew the battle had begun. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen and found her there again, the scent of her expensive perfume in the air, the glare of triumph still sharp. "You are going to pay rent," she said casually. I looked at her and smiled faintly. "Oh, I will," she said, her eyebrows knitting together, "and I will do it my way." She froze for a moment, like a cat caught off guard, and my son glanced at me uncertainly. I sat at the table and poured myself tea, taking slow, deliberate sips as if to anchor myself. Later, I went to the study and pulled out old files and bank statements and deeds tucked away in drawers I had long forgotten. My mind ran over the details, the years I had been cautious and careful, the ownership papers, the mortgage long paid off, the legal proof that this house belonged to me. They had no idea what I held. They had assumed ignorance and submission, and I had allowed the assumption to stand for too long. I began to read through every document, my pulse quickening as the pieces fell into place. This house was mine in every legal way. My name was on the deed, my mortgage was paid, my financial records proved it all. I allowed myself a small smile, realizing that the very people who sought to humiliate me were standing in a house they did not own, plotting against someone who was quietly more powerful than they realized. I thought about my son and the sadness that laced his obedience. But I also knew that love sometimes demanded hard lessons. The ember of defiance grew as the sun set, painting the walls with golden light. I felt a sense of clarity I had not known for years. This was no longer just about money or respect. This was about reclaiming dignity and asserting boundaries. I would not fight with anger or cruelty. I would move with strategy, patience, and quiet determination. I sat at the kitchen table through the evening and planned my next moves, considering the timing, the paperwork, the conversations I would need to have, and the allies I could quietly enlist. My mind flicked back to friends and neighbors who had always supported me, who had witnessed my son grow, and who would understand the situation. I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I would reclaim my home without losing my own moral center. And as I sat there, the house seemed to settle around me in quiet approval, as if it understood the storm that would soon pass through its walls. I would wait for the right moment, and when it came, they would be shocked. They would realize that power is not always loud and that respect is earned, not demanded. I went to bed that night with a small but steady flame of hope and determination burning inside me. I was no longer a passive participant in my own life. I was preparing to step fully into the authority that had always been mine. The following morning, I acted as if nothing had happened. I greeted them calmly, made tea and small talk, while my mind raced. Each word I spoke was measured, each smile deliberate. They watched me closely, expecting weakness or desperation, and found neither. My daughter-in-law's triumph seemed to falter as she realized I was not afraid, not submissive. My son glanced at me with a mixture of confusion and curiosity, and I knew he had noticed the shift. I had been underestimated, and I would use it to my advantage. I spent the day revisiting more papers, checking every detail, confirming every fact about ownership and finances. I made calls quietly, seeking advice and confirming legal steps I could take. I thought about the emotional weight of betrayal, the sting of humiliation, the slow accumulation of disrespect that had brought us to this point, and I allowed myself to feel it fully, without letting it control me. I reflected on the life I had lived, the sacrifices made, the patience endured, the love given unconditionally, and realized that none of it diminished me. It had strengthened me. As the afternoon turned to evening, I walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, the familiar corners that held a lifetime of memories. I whispered to myself that this house was mine and always had been, and that soon those who had forgotten would be reminded. The quiet power in that thought settled over me like a protective blanket. I would wait for the night when they slept, when the arrogance of triumph had lulled them into complacency, and then I would act. I did not need rage or malice. I only needed patience and precision and the knowledge that I held the upper hand. That night, I prepared myself mentally, reviewing all documents and plotting the sequence of events I would follow. Every detail mattered, timing mattered, precision mattered. I lay in bed listening to the soft ticking of the clock, thinking about justice and dignity, and the quiet thrill of a plan forming that would restore both. I closed my eyes knowing that the morning would bring opportunity and that I would be ready.
The next morning, I woke before anyone else and moved quietly through the house, careful not to disturb them. I drank my tea by the window and watched the sunlight stretch across the garden, thinking about how easily people take for granted what is freely given. My daughter-in-law's voice drifted from the kitchen as she ordered my son to fetch her coffee and toast, as if we were all her servants. I clenched my fists, but let the silence speak louder than any words could. My son obeyed, without protest, and I could see the flicker of guilt in his eyes, but still, he did nothing. It hurt more than anger. It was a quiet, piercing ache to see the boy I raised bending to someone else's whim. I wanted to speak, but knew that any confrontation now would only reveal the storm that was quietly gathering in me. By late morning, she had found a reason to humiliate me in front of our neighbors. She insisted that I had to reorganize the living room furniture to meet her aesthetic standards, as if decades of careful arrangement meant nothing. When I politely suggested that the layout had always worked, she rolled her eyes and said, "You're making it about you again." My son mumbled, "Sorry, Mom, she's right." That word right, like my opinions and memories had no weight, stabbed me deeper than anything she could have said herself. I nodded slowly, smiling faintly as if humoring a child, and carried on moving the furniture, my hands steady despite the heat rising in my chest. Later, during lunch, she asked me how much I could contribute toward the rent. I stayed quiet, pretending to consider the question as if it were a casual matter, while she spoke confidently about contracts and bills. My son sat beside her, silent but complicit, nodding occasionally like he was absorbing instructions from a stranger. I sipped my tea, pretending calm, but inside, the fire of indignation burned hotter with each passing minute. Was this how it was going to be? Had all those years of love and sacrifice amounted to nothing more than a bill to be negotiated? As the days went on, her control seemed to grow. She decided which groceries to buy, how I could use the kitchen, even what I should wear when leaving the house. My son rarely spoke up, and when he did, his words were weak and apologetic. I found myself retreating to my study more often, seeking the comfort of solitude and reflection. Sitting at the old oak desk I had purchased the year my son graduated high school, I ran my hands over the papers, deeds, and old contracts I had been gathering. My mind worked through every detail, calculating quietly and methodically. They thought they had all the power, but I had learned long ago that quiet patience often outweighed loud authority. One afternoon, the situation escalated. My daughter-in-law had invited some of her friends over and decided that my presence was somehow an inconvenience. She whispered to my son, and he agreed that I should serve drinks and snacks, moving between the living room and kitchen as if I were a hired hand. I carried the tray with my head high, hiding the humiliation behind a serene smile. I heard her laughing at something trivial and felt the sting of being dismissed, of being erased from my own home. But inside me, the ember of defiance glowed stronger. I reminded myself that patience was a weapon and that observation was a tool. Every smirk, every directive, every little attempt to belittle me was being stored carefully in my mind. At night, when the house grew quiet, I reflected on my life. I thought about my own mother, who had endured much and taught me that respect must be demanded through presence and action, not through pleading. I remembered the sacrifices I had made raising my son, the countless nights I stayed awake worrying about him, the years of quiet labor that had built a safe, loving home for my family. I questioned myself briefly, wondering if perhaps I had been too soft, too trusting. But then I felt the deep, unwavering certainty that I still held power they had underestimated. I had the deed, I had the financial means, and I had the patience. What they lacked was foresight, and that was their weakness. The following day, I reached out to a neighbor who had known me for decades, someone whose wisdom and counsel I trusted. I recounted the situation carefully, leaving out no detail, not even the subtle manipulations or the silent complicity of my son. She listened quietly and then smiled with a gentle firmness. "You have been patient long enough," she said. "Sometimes the only way people learn is by showing them that their assumptions were wrong." I nodded slowly, feeling a measure of validation that steadied the shaking in my hands. I began to see a path forward, one that did not rely on confrontation, but on the quiet assertion of truth and ownership. That evening, as I prepared dinner, my daughter-in-law hovered, offering helpful suggestions and critiquing my choices. I let her talk, nodding politely, all the while planning in my mind how I would assert myself. I thought about timing, how actions taken while people slept or while they were unaware often had the most dramatic impact. I reflected on every detail I had gathered over the past weeks, every document, every bank statement, every proof that the house was legally mine. A plan began to crystallize, not born of vengeance, but of justice, quiet and unstoppable. When my son questioned me about my prolonged study of old papers, I smiled softly and said, "I'm just making sure everything is in order." He frowned, as if sensing a change, but unable to pinpoint it, and turned away. I realized then that the first steps toward empowerment were internal. My own certainty, my own patience, and my quiet preparation were the foundation upon which everything else would rest. I no longer felt like a victim. I felt like a strategist, a woman who had been underestimated for too long and who would now act with precision. Late at night, I went through the house, room by room, touching the familiar corners and breathing in the scent of home. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, every worn spot on the carpet reminded me that this place was mine. My daughter-in-law might have claimed authority, my son might have faltered, but I knew the truth.
My patience had been tested, my dignity had been challenged, and yet I was still standing. And I would act when the moment was right, not out of cruelty, not out of anger, but out of necessity. I lay awake in bed that night, plotting the quiet steps that would turn humiliation into empowerment. I pictured the shock on their faces when they finally realized that the house, the home, the very life they had tried to control belonged legally and morally to me. And as sleep finally claimed me, I whispered a silent vow. I would reclaim my home and my dignity, and they would learn that respect is not demanded, it is earned, and that no amount of manipulation could erase what was rightfully mine. The next morning, I woke before anyone else again, a habit I had developed to steal a few hours of peace and reflection before the household chaos began. The sun had barely touched the horizon when I made my way to the study, spreading out the deeds, contracts, and bank statements I had carefully gathered over the past weeks. I traced the lines of my name on the property deed with a fingertip, feeling the weight and power of ownership settle in my chest. My daughter-in-law's dominance over the house had given me a sense of urgency, but now that urgency had transformed into quiet determination. I realized that patience, when paired with knowledge, could be more formidable than anger or confrontation. Later that morning, my son approached me hesitantly while I arranged papers on the desk. "Mother," he said quietly, "are you sure we should push back like this?" His eyes were clouded with guilt and doubt. I looked at him calmly and said, "I am only ensuring that what is mine remains mine. I have lived my life respecting you, respecting her, and respecting this home. Now it's time they learn the truth." He nodded slowly, conflicted, yet he did not interrupt me. That small nod felt like a bridge forming, a reminder that even those who falter can still recognize integrity if given time and space. That afternoon, she summoned me to reorganize the linen closet, declaring that my arrangement was inefficient and outdated. I smiled politely, opened the closet, and began moving the towels, folding the sheets, all the while calculating the precise timing for the steps I would take. Her eyes darted to mine occasionally, suspicious, as if she sensed a change in my demeanor, but could not pinpoint its nature. I allowed her to talk herself into exhaustion, correcting imaginary mistakes and giving me instructions I neither needed nor intended to follow. All the while, my thoughts remained on the night's plan. The papers hidden in the drawer, the legal proof that my house had always belonged to me. That evening, while she prepared dinner and insisted I help, I discovered an unexpected ally in the quietest of voices. My grandson, only 10, sat at the kitchen table observing the exchanges, sensing the tension but too young to fully understand the legal complexities. His small hand found mine under the table, and he whispered, "Grandma, they're being unfair." I smiled, squeezing his hand gently, realizing that sometimes empowerment comes from unexpected places. He did not need to know the details, only that I had not forgotten him or myself.
That brief moment of solidarity, that innocent recognition of injustice, filled me with a quiet warmth and reinforced my determination. The days that followed brought escalating attempts at control and humiliation. She instructed me on how to clean windows, insisting that my method was inefficient. She critiques my cooking, my placement of chairs, even the way I tended to the garden. Each incident was a test, and I endured them all silently, recording them meticulously in my mind. Each affront was cataloged not for revenge, but for clarity, proof of their disregard for boundaries and respect. I kept thinking about the lessons I had learned from my own mother. Dignity is maintained not through shouting, but through measured action, through calm assertion, through waiting for the right moment to reclaim what has always been yours. One night, as I sat alone in the study, reviewing the documents again, I felt the gravity of my plan settle fully into my mind. The house was legally mine. Every contract, every mortgage payment, every deed, every record of ownership was proof. My daughter-in-law had assumed ignorance, and my son had been swayed by loyalty or fear, but neither had accounted for the quiet power of preparation. I allowed myself a small, private smile, imagining the shock on their faces when the truth was revealed. Not anger, not cruelty, but undeniable, factual authority. The following morning, my daughter-in-law insisted on taking me to the bank to settle the rent account. I played along, nodding obediently, letting her believe she had the upper hand. I noted every step of the way, every casual smile she gave, every glance my son cast at me, unaware that the entire trajectory of control had shifted quietly in my favor. At the bank, I signed papers she believed were routine, legal documents she assumed confirmed her dominance, while secretly arranging the transfer of the house ownership to my account fully with terms that would secure my autonomy. Each stroke of the pen was deliberate, each signature a quiet assertion of authority she had never anticipated. That night, as they slept, I reviewed my plan one last time. I felt a calm thrill, a steady confidence not born of malice, but of inevitability. My daughter-in-law had demanded control, my son had faltered, and the house had been threatened, yet now the balance of power was ready to shift. I reflected on my own strength, on the patience that had allowed me to endure humiliation, and on the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing the truth will eventually be seen. I realized that empowerment does not need to be loud. It only needs to be certain and precise.
Over the next few days, I continued my careful observance, pretending to comply with every demand, every critique, every micromanagement. She reveled in her imagined victory, unaware that every small act of control she exercised only fueled the precision of my plan. My son occasionally glanced at me with confusion, sensing the subtle shift, but his fear or habit of obedience kept him silent. My grandson, however, watched with quiet admiration, sometimes whispering encouragement under the table, reminding me that dignity, even when challenged, is a lesson worth teaching. The subtle turning point arrived unexpectedly during a quiet moment in the garden. My neighbor, who had always known me and my family, stopped by with a small smile and words of quiet wisdom. She reminded me that patience and preparation were more powerful than confrontation, and that sometimes justice is most effective when it arrives silently but indisputably. I nodded, feeling validated, and the final pieces of my plan fell into place. I would act with precision and timing, ensuring that the humiliation endured by me would be mirrored in the shock that would greet those who had sought to undermine me. That night, as I lay awake listening to the familiar creaks of the house, I felt a sense of calm inevitability. The house was mine, the power quietly restored to me, and the lesson was about to be delivered. I whispered to myself that the morning would bring revelation, not through anger, but through undeniable truth. I reflected on the weeks of quiet endurance, of humiliation endured without protest, and felt a deep satisfaction knowing that the moment of justice was approaching. I was ready, not just to reclaim my home, but to reclaim my dignity, my boundaries, and the respect that had long been denied. The morning came quietly, the kind of stillness that always preceded change. I moved through the house as usual, greeting them with polite smiles, nodding as my daughter-in-law barked instructions I no longer felt compelled to follow exactly. She did not notice the subtle changes in my tone, the quiet confidence in my steps, or the way I moved through the rooms with the assurance of ownership. My son glanced at me once, confused by the calm in my eyes, the hint of a plan hidden behind a serene expression. I knew he had not realized yet how carefully I had orchestrated the coming shift. Later that day, she demanded that I assist with the garden. Her voice dripped with condescension, her eyes sharp with imagined authority. As we knelt side by side planting new flowers, she lectured me on spacing, watering, and the correct angle for sunlight. I nodded politely, adjusting my hands to her instructions without protest, all the while thinking about the final steps I needed to take. Every word she spoke was recorded in my mind, every condescending glance catalogued. I realized that the more she sought to control, the more obvious her ignorance of my knowledge became. I smiled quietly to myself, feeling a rising thrill at the inevitability of the coming reveal. That evening, my grandson appeared beside me in the kitchen, peering up with curious eyes. "Grandma," he whispered, "you're different today. You look stronger." I reached down and kissed his forehead gently, whispering, "Thank you, sweet boy. Sometimes strength has to be quiet before it can be seen." His small hand held mine for a moment, and I felt the simple power of family loyalty, the kind that can never be manufactured or forced. His presence reminded me that what I was doing was not just for myself, but for the lessons he would carry into his own life, the knowledge that dignity and respect cannot be begged for. They must be honored. As the week progressed, I began to put small pieces of the plan into motion. I contacted the bank to confirm the transfer details, double-checking the signatures, the paperwork, and the timing. Each phone call was conducted with a calm, measured voice that concealed the storm of satisfaction building inside me. I reviewed the documents again and again, ensuring that every I was dotted, every T crossed, every legal clause airtight. My daughter-in-law assumed I was compliant. My son assumed I was meek. And yet, quietly, steadily, I was reclaiming the house that had always been mine. One evening, my daughter-in-law tried to embarrass me during a small dinner party she had invited. She commented on my cooking in a loud, exaggerated tone, laughing as if everyone should find fault in my methods. I smiled politely, serving the food carefully, ignoring her attempt to draw attention. I noticed my grandson watching her, his eyes wide with discomfort. I leaned over and whispered, "Let it pass, sweet boy." Sometimes silence teaches lessons louder than words. I felt the ember of triumph inside me grow. Each slight, each attempt at control only sharpened my resolve. I would not react out of anger. I would act with precision when the time was right. Late that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat at the desk in the study once again. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of old wood, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the rhythm of my own heartbeat. I spread out the deeds, contracts, and bank statements one last time, reviewing each line, each clause, each piece of proof that I was legally and morally the rightful owner of this home. I smiled quietly. Soon, they would learn that power is not always loud, that respect cannot be demanded, and that assumptions of ignorance are often the most dangerous mistakes one can make. The following morning, my daughter-in-law began her usual routine of micromanaging everything. She instructed me on how to set the table for breakfast, corrected my placement of utensils, and offered unsolicited advice on my choice of clothing. I listened, nodding politely, while inside I carefully timed every step of the next phase of my plan. I knew exactly when I would execute it, and I knew it would come as a complete shock. My son glanced at me, once again puzzled by my calm demeanor, sensing only that something had changed, but unable to identify what. By midweek, I had completed all the preliminary actions. I confirmed the final legal transfers and arranged the timing so that the moment of revelation would occur while they were asleep, their assumptions about me fully intact. Every detail had been checked, every contingency accounted for. The confidence I felt was not born of arrogance, but of careful preparation, of the knowledge that patience and strategy often yield far greater results than anger or confrontation. My heart felt steady, and a quiet thrill pulsed through me, knowing that the humiliation I had endured would soon give way to justice. That evening, as the household settled into routine, I spoke quietly to my grandson. He watched me with admiration and trust, unaware of the full plan, but sensing the shift in energy. "Remember," I whispered, "strength sometimes shows up in small ways, in quiet actions, in being patient." He nodded solemnly, and I realized that the lessons I had learned through years of sacrifice were now ready to pass on, even in small ways, to the next generation. I felt a wave of calm satisfaction wash over me, the first true relief I had experienced since the ordeal began. Late at night, after everyone had gone to bed, I moved silently through the house. I double-checked the paperwork, reviewed the transfer confirmation, and prepared the final documents for the bank. My daughter-in-law's assumptions of control had lulled her into complacency. My son's conflicted loyalty had kept him from noticing the quiet shifts. And I, having endured humiliation and maintained patience, was now poised to reclaim what had always been mine. I allowed myself a brief moment of reflection, thinking about the weeks of subtle torment, the emotional weight of disrespect, and the clarity that had emerged from it all. I felt a sense of peace and empowerment that I had not known in years. I returned to my bedroom, heart steady, mind sharp, and whispered a vow into the darkness. Tomorrow, everything would change. I would not act out of revenge, but out of justice, reclaiming the home, the respect, and the dignity that had been challenged but never broken. And as I drifted into sleep, I carried with me the quiet knowledge that patience, strategy, and unwavering belief in oneself often wield the greatest power, even against those who assume dominance. I paused for a moment in the dim light of the hallway, looking around at the walls I had built my life within. The photographs of my son as a boy, of birthdays, graduations, family gatherings, seemed to shimmer in the soft light. I remembered the countless nights I had stayed awake worrying, planning, protecting, giving without expectation. And now, for the first time in years, the scales of respect and dignity were about to tip in my favor. I slid the documents into a secure envelope, double-checking every signature, every clause, every legal stipulation. I whispered to myself, softly but firmly, "This is mine. I have earned this." The next morning, my daughter-in-law woke late, her usual energy already spent from yesterday's attempt at control.
She called my son to bring her breakfast in bed, as if she were the queen of the house, and he obeyed without hesitation. I watched quietly from the kitchen, pouring myself a cup of tea, savoring the calm before the storm. Every movement I made was deliberate, careful to seem ordinary, routine, innocuous. She did not notice the envelope tucked safely in my bag, the proof that the tables were about to turn. She believed her victory was complete. She believed I was weak and compliant, and she was wrong. By mid-morning, I had made a few discreet calls to finalize the sale, each conversation calm and deliberate, each step ensuring the house would legally change hands without her knowledge. I smiled faintly as I listened to the confirmations over the phone, the certainty of the legal system on my side, the precision of preparation ensuring no loopholes remained. I reminded myself that this was not cruelty, but rightful action. Every insult, every micromanagement, every attempt to belittle me had been recorded, observed, and stored for context. Justice would be delivered quietly, effectively, and with undeniable clarity. When my daughter-in-law finally wandered into the kitchen, still humming a tune she thought was cheerful, I greeted her politely. "Good morning," I said calmly, and she paused, eyebrow raised, as if sensing a shift she could not define. My son brought her breakfast and toast, oblivious to the quiet storm forming in the study where the final documents waited. She chattered about furniture placement, the color of curtains, and the proper order for breakfast items, expecting compliance, expecting meekness. I nodded, smiled faintly, and let her ramble. Every word she spoke only reinforced my resolve, reminding me of the weeks of humiliation endured and the patient preparation that had brought me here. Late that afternoon, after she had finally grown tired and retired to the bedroom for a nap, I moved quietly to the study, carrying the envelope with the finalized sale documents. My hands were steady, my heart calm. I double-checked everything one last time, imagining the shock, the disbelief, and the silence that would greet them once the truth was revealed. I felt no anger, only a quiet satisfaction, the satisfaction of knowing that the house, my home, the place that held my life's memories, was being reclaimed in a manner that left no room for denial or argument. By evening, the house felt unusually quiet. I lingered in the living room, pretending to read a book while my daughter-in-law dozed in the bedroom. My son was distracted with his phone, unaware that the foundation of his assumptions was quietly shifting beneath him. I took a deep breath, savoring the calm precision of the moment, and mentally rehearsed the morning when the reveal would occur. I pictured their faces, the realization dawning slowly, then suddenly, the way their assumptions about control and authority would crumble in an instant. That night, I lay in bed thinking about the lessons embedded in this quiet act. Years of sacrifice, patience, and endurance had led to this precise moment. I reflected on the emotional toll of humiliation, the sting of betrayal, and the quiet strength that had carried me through the past weeks. I whispered softly to no one but myself, "This is justice. This is patience. This is dignity reclaimed." And somewhere in the silence, I felt the weight of control settle back into my hands, steady and unshakable. The following morning, I waited until the soft hum of early activity began in the house. My daughter-in-law emerged from her bedroom, refreshed and cheerful, completely unaware of the quiet revolution that had occurred while she slept. My son followed behind her, carrying coffee and toast, still operating under the assumption that nothing had changed. I greeted them with a calm smile,
carrying myself with the ease of someone who knew a truth they did not yet understand. And then I placed the envelope on the kitchen table, deliberately visible, casually announcing, "I thought you might like to see this." Her eyes flicked to the envelope, curiosity and confusion mingling in a brief, sharp glance. She reached for it, then paused, sensing something unfamiliar in my tone, in the calm authority in my posture. My son leaned over, reading quickly, confusion dawning in his eyes, and then, as the realization sank in, his hand froze over the page. The envelope contained the finalized sale documents, all legal, all binding, all unmistakably in my name. The house was legally sold, transferred, and secured. Ownership was undisputed, unquestionable, and utterly undeniable. Her voice caught, a sharp, disbelieving sound, and she stared at me as though she were seeing me for the first time. "How? How could this be?" she stammered, unable to finish the sentence. My son turned to me, eyes wide, silent. I smiled quietly, gently, without a trace of malice. "It's simple," I said softly. "This house has always been mine. I only needed to wait for the right moment." I let the weight of my words settle, the silence stretching between us like a tangible presence. Shock, disbelief, and the faintest flicker of regret danced across their faces, mirrored in the small, odd gaze of my grandson who had watched everything unfold. I sat down calmly, sipping my tea, letting them process the truth. I had not acted out of anger or cruelty. I had simply reclaimed what was mine, asserting boundaries that had long been ignored, reminding everyone present that respect is not given lightly and that assumptions of weakness are often fatal. My daughter-in-law's triumphant smile had vanished, replaced by stunned silence. My son looked at me with a mixture of awe and guilt, understanding for the first time the depth of patience, strategy, and quiet power that had guided my actions. The morning after the sale, the house felt different, charged with a quiet tension that made every step deliberate. I moved through the rooms calmly, greeting my grandson with a gentle smile and acknowledging my son with soft nods, while my daughter-in-law hovered, unsure of what had shifted. The envelope I had placed on the table the previous day remained open, the legal documents visible for all to see. She stood there, rigid, attempting to mask her shock, her fingers twisting nervously. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the silence grow heavier, letting the truth land fully in the space between us. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling slightly. How could you? This is impossible." I looked at her gently, calmly, and said softly, "This house has always been mine. I only needed the right moment to make it clear." My tone carried no anger, only certainty and the weight of years of endurance and preparation. She opened her mouth again, but no words came. My son, who had been silent, his eyes wide with awe and confusion, finally spoke. "Mom, he faltered, unable to form the words. I reached out and touched his arm, a gentle reminder that my love for him had not diminished, that my actions were not born of malice, only of justice and dignity. The realization hit her slowly, like a tide creeping over rocks. She had assumed control, had believed that dominance was hers by virtue of intimidation and manipulation. She had not accounted for patience, strategy, or the quiet power of knowledge. Her face, once confident and smug, now reflected disbelief and a flicker of fear. She glanced between the papers and me, unable to reconcile the quiet authority she was witnessing with the woman she had dismissed for so long. Every insult, every micromanagement, every attempt to belittle me now seemed to evaporate in the face of undeniable truth. My son turned to her, his voice soft, hesitant, filled with dawning comprehension. "Mom was right," he said finally, looking at me with a mixture of awe and shame. She is always right." I nodded, keeping my tone calm, my eyes steady. "The house is legally mine," I repeated softly. "Not out of vengeance, not out of anger, but because this is the truth." They both looked at me in silence, trying to process the shift, to understand how I had achieved something they had assumed impossible. The silence was heavy and complete, the kind that fills a room with the weight of acknowledgement and respect. She finally spoke again, voice small and uncertain. But how?" I smiled faintly, the corners of my lips lifting just enough to convey calm satisfaction. "You underestimated me," I said. "You assumed compliance and weakness, but patience and preparation often wield the greatest power." My son nodded again, his eyes moist with a quiet understanding, recognizing for the first time the depth of patience and strategy that had guided my every step. The room remained still, my grandson watching quietly, his small hands folded in front of him, eyes wide with admiration and understanding. Over the next few days, she attempted to regain control, issuing instructions, making demands, trying to reassert dominance. Each time, I responded calmly, gently, but firmly. I would listen, acknowledge, and act only when appropriate, demonstrating that authority cannot be forced by intimidation. Slowly, the tension in the house shifted. My daughter-in-law began to realize that her power had never truly existed in this space, that respect cannot be commanded, and that assumptions of ignorance are often the most dangerous mistake one can make. She grew quieter, her once confident demeanor faltering under the weight of undeniable truth. One evening, my son approached me privately, his voice low and filled with emotion. "Mom," he said, "I didn't realize. All these years, you have always been stronger than I knew." I reached out and held his hands, smiling gently. "It's okay," I said softly. "Strength isn't always loud, and patience can teach lessons that anger cannot." He nodded, absorbing the words, and I realized that in this moment he had begun to understand the quiet power that comes from endurance, strategy, and calm authority. As the days passed, my daughter-in-law's behavior changed. She stopped issuing commands, stopped attempting to control every action, and began to observe, cautious and uncertain. Her earlier triumphs evaporated in the face of undeniable legal authority and the quiet, unshakable confidence I exuded. Every time she attempted to challenge me, I responded with measured calm, showing her that control is not granted through intimidation, but earned through action, knowledge, and unwavering patience. Slowly, she began to respect boundaries she had once dismissed, and I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that justice had been delivered without cruelty. My grandson, ever observant, noticed the subtle changes. "Grandma, you've won. They finally get it." I smiled, leaning down to kiss his forehead gently. "Yes," I said softly. "Respect is not something that can be demanded. It must be understood and honored." He nodded, a small smile spreading across his face, and I felt a profound sense of peace.
The lessons of patience, endurance, and quiet empowerment were being absorbed not just by me, but by the next generation. I spent the following week moving through the house with a sense of calm authority, overseeing tasks, checking documents, and guiding the household with quiet, steady assurance. My daughter-in-law's confidence had been replaced with cautious observation, and my son's loyalty had returned, tempered now with a deeper understanding of respect and integrity. The house, once a place of humiliation and manipulation, had become a space of restored dignity, calm, and order. I realized then that empowerment is not about revenge. It is about reclaiming one's rightful place with grace and certainty. Late one night, I reflected on the weeks of struggle, humiliation, and quiet preparation. I thought about the patience required to endure disrespect without retaliation, the careful strategy needed to turn disadvantage into power, and the profound satisfaction that comes from achieving justice calmly and precisely. I whispered into the quiet house, "This is peace. This is dignity. This is respect earned, not begged for." And somewhere in the stillness, I felt the weight of years lift from my shoulders, replaced by a serene sense of empowerment and the quiet knowledge that the lesson had been learned. The days that followed felt strangely peaceful, almost surreal. The house, once filled with tension and quiet battles, now carried a sense of calm I had longed for. My daughter-in-law moved cautiously, her once loud commands reduced to tentative suggestions. She watched me with an awareness she hadn't possessed before, as if seeing me fully for the first time. My son, too, seemed transformed, no longer swayed by fear or habit, but thoughtful and deliberate in his actions. The household had shifted, subtly but irrevocably, and the quiet empowerment I had cultivated was now evident in every interaction. One afternoon, I found myself in the living room with my grandson. He was quietly coloring, the sunlight streaming through the windows, casting golden light on the page. "Grandma," he said softly, "I think everyone finally understands." I smiled, running a hand over his hair. "Yes," I said, "it's important for them to learn that respect is never automatic. It has to be earned and cherished." He nodded solemnly, absorbing the lesson even in his small, unassuming way. I realized then that the most profound victories are not measured by confrontation or anger, but by the quiet awareness that one has acted with integrity and dignity. My daughter-in-law approached me later that evening, hesitantly, her posture cautious. "I wanted to talk," she said softly, and I listened carefully, noting the subtle changes in her tone, the respect that had replaced the arrogance. I nodded, giving her the space to speak without judgment. She admitted that she had misjudged me, that her attempts to control had been misguided, and that she now understood the depth of patience, strategy, and quiet strength I had brought to bear. I listened, acknowledging her words without bitterness, recognizing that understanding and humility are valuable steps toward reconciliation. My son entered the room, standing beside her, and I felt the full weight of the family I had built, the love and loyalty that had endured despite moments of conflict. He apologized for failing to see the situation clearly, for siding too easily with assumptions and intimidation. I accepted his words gently, reassuring him that growth comes from understanding mistakes and learning from them. The moment was quiet but powerful, a recognition that even when love falters, it can be strengthened by patience, reflection, and integrity. Over the next few days, routines returned, but the dynamic had changed. The household operated with a balance that had been missing before. My daughter-in-law no longer attempted to dominate. Instead, she observed and participated with a newfound humility. My son engaged thoughtfully, respecting boundaries and acknowledging contributions without hesitation. My grandson continued to watch and learn, absorbing the lessons of patience, dignity, and quiet empowerment that I had long embodied. I realized then that the house had become more than a physical space. It had transformed into a sanctuary of understanding, respect, and calm authority. One evening, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, I reflected on the weeks that had passed, the humiliation I had endured, the quiet battles I had fought, and the patience I had cultivated had all led to this moment. I understood now that empowerment is not achieved through loud confrontation, but through careful preparation, integrity, and unwavering belief in oneself. I whispered softly to the empty room, "This is what patience can achieve. This is what dignity looks like." And in that quiet, steady moment, I felt a profound sense of peace. I thought back to my own mother, who had taught me that respect must be earned, and that quiet strength often speaks louder than anger. I realized that her lessons had carried me through more than I had ever imagined, guiding me to act with precision, wisdom, and unwavering calm. The experience had not only restored my home and my dignity, but had also reinforced the deep values of patience, strategy, and moral clarity that I hoped to pass on to my grandson. I smiled softly, imagining him carrying these lessons forward into his own life, understanding that true strength often lies in restraint and thoughtful action. By the weekend, the house had settled fully into a new rhythm. My daughter-in-law now contributed without expectation of control. My son engaged with awareness and respect, and my grandson moved confidently within the space, absorbing lessons quietly but effectively. I walked through each room with a sense of pride and calm satisfaction, appreciating the simple beauty of harmony restored. The house, once a battleground of ego and manipulation, had become a place of dignity, mutual respect, and quiet empowerment. That night, I spoke gently to my grandson before bed. "Remember," I said softly, "strength is quiet. Power is not always loud. Patience, integrity, and preparation often achieve what anger cannot." He nodded, eyes wide and thoughtful, and I felt a wave of contentment wash over me. The lessons had been learned, not through humiliation or rage, but through careful, deliberate action and unwavering moral clarity. As I lay in bed that night, I reflected on the journey I had undertaken, the humiliation I had endured, the emotional pain, and the subtle, quiet manipulations I had weathered had all prepared me for this precise moment of reclamation. I understood now that empowerment is a process, a careful orchestration of patience, strategy, and self-respect. I whispered to the quiet house, "Thank you for carrying me through this, for witnessing the strength that has always been mine." And somewhere in the stillness, I felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that respect, once regained, is never so easily lost. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, spilling warmth across the living room. I moved quietly, deliberately, savoring the calm that had settled over the house.
For the first time in weeks, there was no tension, no sharp words, no invisible battles for control. My daughter-in-law was in the kitchen preparing breakfast with a newfound hesitancy, her previous arrogance replaced with cautious respect. My son moved about with quiet awareness, attentive yet unobtrusive. And my grandson sat at the table, sketching and humming, the innocence of youth untouched by the turmoil that had once filled these rooms. I poured myself a cup of tea and settled into my favorite armchair, feeling the weight of the house's history around me. Every corner, every photograph, every piece of furniture held memories of joy, sacrifice, and love. But now, intertwined with those memories, was a quiet victory, a reminder that dignity and respect once denied could be restored through patience, strategy, and self-determination. I smiled softly, savoring the realization that I had not acted out of malice, but out of the simple assertion of truth. My daughter-in-law approached me hesitantly, carrying a plate of toast. I accepted it with a nod, my voice gentle. "Thank you," I said. She paused, glancing at me, a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "I can see now that I misjudged things," she admitted softly. "I didn't understand. All I saw was what I thought was control." I nodded, acknowledging her words without anger. "Understanding takes time," I said softly. "Recognition and humility are the first steps towards respect." She lowered her gaze, silently absorbing the lesson. My son joined us then, leaning down to kiss my cheek gently. "Mom," he said quietly, "I'm sorry for doubting you, for not seeing things clearly before." I reached out, taking his hands in mine. "It's okay," I whispered. "Life teaches us lessons in unexpected ways. What matters is that we learn and grow." His eyes filled with a mixture of relief, admiration, and love, and I realized then that the bond between parent and child had not only endured but deepened through the trials we had faced. Later, as the day unfolded, I moved through the house with a sense of quiet authority, overseeing small tasks, guiding where necessary, and allowing them space to adjust to the new balance. My daughter-in-law no longer issued commands. Instead, she participated thoughtfully, offering input only when appropriate. My son engaged with awareness and patience, respecting boundaries without hesitation. The house, once a stage for tension and humiliation, had transformed into a sanctuary of dignity, understanding, and calm collaboration. I spent a long moment in the study, reflecting on the past weeks. The humiliation I had endured, the microaggressions and the subtle manipulations had all been trials of patience and resilience. Each insult, each demand for compliance had been a test of my inner strength, a reminder that empowerment is cultivated quietly, often unnoticed by those who attempt to dominate. And now, as the calm settled over the household, I understood that the most profound victories are not loud or public. They are quiet, undeniable, and lasting. That evening, my grandson wandered into the study, his small hands clutching a sketchbook. "Grandma," he said, "you were amazing." I smiled, running my fingers through his hair. "Thank you," I whispered. "Remember, strength is quiet. Power is measured not by loudness or intimidation, but by patience, integrity, and unwavering self-respect." He nodded solemnly, absorbing the lesson, and I felt a deep sense of continuity. The knowledge and wisdom I had gained would carry forward into the next generation, shaping him in ways that no confrontation or argument ever could. As the sun set, casting golden light across the living room, I walked slowly through the house, observing every detail, every corner filled with memories. I thought about the weeks of subtle humiliation, the quiet battles, and the meticulous planning that had led to this moment. I whispered softly into the stillness, "This is peace. This is dignity. This is respect reclaimed." And in that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm, knowing that justice had been delivered without cruelty, that the house and my own sense of self was restored. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I reflected on the lessons learned. I understood now that empowerment is not achieved through shouting, anger, or vindictiveness. It is cultivated through patience, careful planning, and quiet assertion of truth. I thought about my daughter-in-law, my son, and my grandson, and I realized that the journey we had taken together had been as much about emotional growth as it had been about reclaiming physical space. Respect, I thought, cannot be demanded. It must be recognized, earned, and understood. I closed my eyes, letting the stillness of the night envelop me. The trials had strengthened me, the humiliation had refined me, and the quiet victories had affirmed my inner strength. I felt gratitude for the lessons learned, for the calm empowerment I had cultivated, and for the family who, despite missteps, had grown alongside me. I whispered softly, "Thank you for patience, for perseverance, for clarity, and for dignity." And somewhere in the darkness, I felt a profound sense of closure, a deep peace, and a quiet, unshakable empowerment that would carry me through the years ahead. The next morning, the household moved with a new rhythm. Laughter returned in small, careful bursts. Conversations were more thoughtful, interactions more genuine. My daughter-in-law, once domineering and dismissive, now offered help and guidance with humility. My son, once hesitant and conflicted, now acted with awareness and respect. And my grandson, the quiet witness of it all, moved confidently, absorbing the lessons of patience, integrity, and empowerment that had been demonstrated in every subtle action I had taken. I poured myself another cup of tea, sitting in the sunlight streaming through the window, and reflected on the journey. The house, my home, had been challenged, my dignity questioned, and my patience tested. Yet through every trial, I had maintained calm, observed carefully, and acted strategically. Justice had arrived, not through anger, but through preparation and quiet authority. I smiled softly, feeling the profound satisfaction of a lesson well taught, a truth well asserted, and respect fully restored. And in that moment, as the light danced across familiar walls and my family moved with newfound understanding around me, I understood the simplest, most profound truth of all. Respect cannot be begged for. It must be earned, acknowledged, and honored. And when it is, the peace, empowerment, and dignity that follow are worth every moment of patience, every silent endurance, and every careful, deliberate action.